Hey everyone, Steve here from Big Head Tech, and I am super excited about this video. I've been working on it for a few weeks now, getting everything I needed, sourcing the parts. But today, we have a Core i3 10100 versus a Ryzen 3 3300X. My assumption is they're going to be the same price. I'm not entirely sure, but I am very curious to find out if AMD has come far enough, given the same clock speed, the same core count, the same thread count, if it'll actually put away Intel for good. Intel is a big advantage on clock speed on the higher end, and that's why AMD falls off in gaming, but we're going to find out today. Now, unfortunately, I do not have my standard test bench anymore. I am going to be rebuilding one in the up and coming months, but the bench is the same nonetheless. However, you will notice that the RAM is not the same speed. So there's reason for that. Unless you go with the Z490 motherboard, which, and I'm really happy that Gamers Nexus and some other reviewers are starting to see, there's no reason to go theoretical if it doesn't make sense. You're not going to spend $170 on a board and $130 on a CPU, right? So we went with the B460 board, it's $90. And there's no way to go past 2666 megahertz, even though it's a 3200 megahertz kit, CL16. Same power supply, same SSD, same video cards. We're doing 2 cards today. We're up against the Ryzen 3 3300X. Now, I would have won with a less expensive board, but it was the cheapest board that I can actually get my hands on. So, given the way the 3300X performs and its clock speed, its boosting frequency and functionality, honestly, it's not going to make a difference because we're not mainly overclocking. We did push the memory to 3600 megahertz, but we had to bump it to 1820, 2020, 38. So we did have to bump it up a little bit. To be honest, 3200 running 16, 18, 18, 18, 36, I believe is what the default is, was the same number. So it really didn't make that big of a difference. Same SSD and same power supply. We were running on open bench since thermals wasn't very important in this situation, and we're running plenty of cooling. But let's take a look at my favorite benchmark, Cinebench. So I actually decided to make the executive decision to remove Cinebench R15. It really, in my opinion, doesn't have any place in 2020, so we're only looking at R20. Now, I have a lot of different processors on here. It's all the ones I either kept that also are relevant. So what's interesting is that the 10100 is pretty much at the bottom. It actually loses out to a laptop 6-core. Yeah, it's a U SKU, but it actually hits like 30 watts under full load, so it's not really a 15 watt. But multi-core, huge difference, 500 points, and that's around 20, right around 20% difference. And the single thread is also pretty big as well, and that probably attributes to a little bit of the memory bottleneck. So 493 versus 445. That is pretty big. Plus, there also is a small, like 4% CPU advantage. But yeah, so the 10100 really falls behind. It pretty much only beats last generation Ryzen APU, which is actually that 3400G is not even current generation. But what's really also neat is the 3300X is pretty much replacing the R5 1600 and 2600. It only has 4 cores and 8 threads, but given the high clock speeds, the better single core performance, you're going to get very, very similar multi-core performance, but a lot better single threaded performance. Looking at the newer version of Blender BMW version 2.83, I used to use 2.79. So if you remember my older benchmarks, this is not going to match up. These are going to actually complete this test in a shorter period of time. But all of these tests are run with the same version. The i3 10100 falls in the bottom 3, basically barely beating a laptop 6-core, 6-thread CPU. And it falls a bit behind a lot of the last gen stuff. So the 9th gen i5 9600K overclocked, even Ryzen 2000 series with the R5. But looking at the Ryzen 3 3300X with Precision Boost Overdrive, it actually edges out a physical 6-core, and that's impressive because 4 cores and 8 threads is not going to deliver as much oomph generally, apples to apples, versus 6 physical cores. Where this really helps is the single thread performance is so high on these chips, and having a single CCX cluster really helps. But let's take a look at games. First, we're going to look at the 5500 XT, then a GTX 1080. Well, looking at with the RX 5500 XT 1080p, either high or ultra settings, you can see on the test here, they're pretty much dead even. I did notice I had to run the test a lot to average them together. The i3 sometimes scored a couple FPS lower, and that might have to do with the 66 megahertz memory. So I only had to happen a few times, but I was able to get higher numbers, all things considered. But the bottleneck's definitely the GPU here. The 3300X just does win out across the board. But I want to show this test because while you may go with a little bit of a higher end GPU than a 5500 XT, you may already have like an RX 580 or a GTX 1060, and this is the classification of those particular cards. So at this juncture, it's really not going to make a difference, but let's look at the 1080. We actually got some separation. Again, I did have some of the runs not perform consistent with the i3. For example, Forza Horizon 4, the 1080, I was actually getting in the, I got in the upper teens in 2 of my runs, but after running it 3 more times, I scored 123, 124, and 125, which averaged to 124. F1 2018 didn't really get too many issues there. Division 2, I did get 1 low score, and then Ghost Recon Wildlands is pretty consistent. But here we're looking at not a huge gap, but 2 to 3% across the board, the exception of Ghost Recon Wildlands, which does surprise me because the CPU is, about, it's 200 megahertz faster, so you're about 3 to 4%, but you're only about 2 to 3% higher performance. So what's the reason for that? Well, it could be the GPU could still be the bottleneck, and that's why people do do a 2080 Ti to see what the situation is. But let's go and wrap this up, and we're going to talk about this a little bit deeper. So what's going on here? Well, it definitely could be a GPU bottleneck, and it's easy to verify. Steve from Gamers Nexus, he kind of did similar videos with like an RTX 2060 with these chips and stuff like that. But I think it's kind of twofold. I think the 1080 could potentially be bottlenecking because we are running higher settings, right? Basically the settings that you would want to run on either GPU. I also am still afraid that we're going to be running into this same problem over and over again, and that is despite the 3300X having higher single core performance, so higher IPCs, higher instructions per clock, higher frequency, it has a single CCX, so there's really not a lot of latency there, that this Intel chip may actually be able to match it or beat it in some scenarios, like at the same clock speed. And I think it has to do with the way the games are utilizing, how the processor's architecture is designed. And because, AMD was a flop for so long that, the way FX was designed, game developers said, no, we're not even going to address how that addresses cache and latency and pipelines and all that stuff. We're just going to kind of go with tried and true with Intel. And because game development cycles are so long that we're still probably not going to see any games that really favor or at least give AMD a little bit more of a fair match. And I'm seeing this consistently that AMD is scoring higher instructions per clock, higher single-threaded performance at the same exact clock speed, but Intel at the same clock speed is performing better. And it doesn't make any sense. Like a 3900 XT is going to score very close to a 10900K at 5 gigahertz in single core performance. Why does it not perform as well in games in some cases? And I really think it has to do with how the games interact with the architecture of the CPU, with the way, cache levels are designed, communication between, the cache and things like that. I'm not an expert, but I think that is kind of the roadblock we're at. But I think next couple years, when developers started to design their games to utilize multiple different platforms, different CPUs, and things of that nature, we should start seeing that the real performance gap is actually there and not absent, which is what it looks like right now. So that's my conclusion. I could very well be wrong, but it hasn't made sense to me in a while, and I'd be willing to learn and listen if anybody has any information either confirming or disproving my theory. So put that in the description below. If you want to buy anything used in this video, I'll try to put a link. The Amazon. Do note if you buy anything from those links, I do get a commission. Kickback, whatever you want to call it, so full transparency. If you like this video, hit that like button, share it with somebody you think that would benefit from it, and as always, this is Steve from Big Head Tech, and I'll see y'all later on down the road.